August 6, 1941, 11:58 p.m., southwest of Moscow, 3,200 meters above a sleeping city preparing for death. The night sky wasn't dark. It burned. Searchlights sliced through the clouds like white spears. Anti-aircraft batteries thumped across the horizon. Red tracer rounds stitched the heavens, chasing shadows of death. The distant rumble of engines was growing louder. The Luftwaffe was coming again. On the cracked runway of the 177th Fighter Aviation Regiment, a lone Lag-3 fighter screamed into the sky. In its cockpit sat Junior Lieutenant Viktor Vasilyevich Talalikhin, 23 years old, frostbitten hands inside worn Soviet gloves, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He wasn't a legend, not yet. He was a farm boy from Siberia who grew up hunting wolves with a Mosin Magnet. Now, instead of wolves, he hunted German bombers, big, armored beasts carrying death straight from Moscow. The Soviet capital was barely 25 miles away. Civilians were already in panic shelters. The Kremlin's lights had been shut off to hide it from the bombers. The Red Army was being battered on all fronts. Hitler's generals believed Moscow would fall by October. If you're new here, and you want more real, immersive World War II stories that put you right inside the cockpit, the trenches, and behind enemy lines, hit subscribe right now. Most people will scroll past history and forget it ever happened. But not you. You're here because you want to feel it. So click subscribe and like this video before we continue. This story is just getting started. But not tonight. Talalikhin flicked his cockpit gun sight on. The green glow lit his eyes as he pulled his fighter toward the sound of engines. His radio crackled with static and panic. Gorizont 1 to all fighters. Enemy formation approaching from the west. Altitude 3,000. Protect the city. Suddenly the clouds broke, and there it was. A Heinkel H-111. German twin-engine medium bomber moving like a predator through moonlit vapor. The black iron cross was painted boldly across its wing. Its bomb bay doors were closed, meaning it was still armed, still hunting. Talalikhin leaned forward over his control stick. "Got you," he muttered. He flicked his safety off and squeezed the trigger. His cannons roared to life, Schwack 20mm rounds ripping through the night. The tracers hammered the bomber's tail, tearing fabric and shearing metal. The Heinkel jerked violently in the air, banking to avoid him. Inside the German bomber, panic erupted as its dorsal gunner swung a 7.92mm MG-15 toward the target. Yellow fire ripped back at Talalikhin. He banked left, then dove under the bomber to avoid the stream of bullets, pulling up on its blind side. He lined up for the kill shot. Click, click, click. His gunfire stopped. Empty. He tried again. Nothing. The last shell casing spiraled out behind his fighter. He had burned through his ammunition in seconds. That was all he had. The Soviets were rationing ammo so severely that most night fighters launched with barely enough for a single attack run. He should have broken away, returned to base, let someone else finish the kill. But Talalikhin didn't move. Instead, he stayed locked on the Heinkel. No hesitation, no retreat. On the radio, a voice screamed, "Talalikhin, break off! You're empty! Do you hear me? Break off!" But he didn't. He pushed his canopy back and looked down. Moscow's faint glow was under him. His home, his people, his motherland. The Heinkel began accelerating east toward the city.
"If I can't shoot it down, I'll stop it another way." He pushed his throttle forward and pointed his fighter straight at the enemy. This was no longer a dogfight. This was Taran, the Soviet word for ramming attack. a one-way attack of last resort. The Luftwaffe had laughed when they heard about red pilots doing it. They thought it was madness. They thought it was impossible. Talalikhin was about to prove them wrong. And somewhere, deep inside him, he smiled. Tonight, he wasn't going home. The cockpit shook violently as Viktor Talalikhin pushed his LAG-3 into a shallow dive. The wind screamed across the canopy. His airspeed indicator ticked past 410 kilometers per hour, 420, 430. The Heinkel bomber loomed larger with every heartbeat, every breath. This was suicide. At least that's what any sane pilot would call it. But sanity had no place in the sky over Moscow tonight. Talalikhin tightened his harness straps until they dug into his shoulders. One mistake, one miscalculated angle, and his fighter would disintegrate on impact. He wouldn't die instantly. He'd be thrown into burning debris, shredded by metal, or torn apart in free fall. He knew that. He never blinked. Below him, the black shape of the Heinkel He-111 H-3 bomber lumbered forward like a steel whale, oblivious to the predator closing in. Exhaust flames flickered from its engines. Its formation lights were still off. The bomber crew thought they were alone now, clear of the Soviet fighters. They were wrong. Talalikhin pulled alongside the bomber's left side, only 20 meters away, matching its speed. He could see straight into the cockpit windows. The German pilot was focused ahead, unaware of the Soviet fighter creeping into position. Talalikhin spotted movement in the bomber's dorsal gunner position, the shadow of a man bending over, reloading his machine gun. No time. Talalikhin studied his control stick and studied the bomber's shape, not as a machine, but as a target. If he hit its armored fuselage, the collision would kill him instantly. If he struck the engine head-on, the explosion would vaporize them both. But if he struck the outer wing spar, he could break the bomber in half and maybe, just maybe, survive long enough to bail out. He angled slightly upward. Perfect. The Heinkel's gunner finally looked up and froze. His helmeted head snapped around. He saw Talalikhin. Their eyes met for a split second, a moment frozen in the infinity. Talalikhin saw fear. The German dove onto his machine gun. Too late. Talalikhin yanked his nose up and slammed his throttle full forward. He aimed for the left wing. Impact in 3 seconds. The LAG-3 sliced through the night wind like a thrown spear. The distance vanished. Talalikhin braced his arms, teeth clenched hard enough to crack. 2 seconds. A stuttering burst of tracer fire exploded from the bomber's dorsal gun. Talalikhin ducked instinctively as bullets tore past his canopy. 1 second. The Heinkel filled his vision. Metal, rivets, grim black crosses. Contact. The shrieking sound of tearing metal exploded as Talalikhin's propeller sideswiped the German bomber's wing root. The LAG-3's wooden propeller shattered instantly, blades ripping loose and slicing into the Heinkel's left engine. Flames erupted. Oil sprayed across the night sky. The German bomber's wing began to fold, cracking like a breaking bone. Talalikhin's fighter lurched violently, spun from the force of the collision. His engine seized. The entire front of his aircraft vibrated like it was coming apart. He barely stayed conscious. The German crew panicked. One of the gunners was thrown from his position as the bomber began spiraling downward. A chunk of flaming aluminum sliced past Talalikhin's cockpit as he fought to keep control. The two aircraft were now falling together, entangled in chaos, like mortally wounded beasts locked in a final death spiral. Altitude, 2,800 meters. Falling fast. Talalikhin tried his radio. Silence. Smoke flooded his cockpit. His engine was dead. His left wingtip was gone. Flames licked up the engine cowling. He ripped off his oxygen mask and coughed violently. Time to go. He threw his canopy release. The wind ripped it away like tissue paper. He unlatched his harness and froze. His plane was spinning too violently. If he ejected now, he'd be sucked into the tail and shredded. He waited, feeling death breathe down the back of his neck. Then, an opening. He kicked the rudder hard, rolled slightly, and jumped. The night exploded around him. Wind roared past his ears. The burning wreckage spun above him as he tumbled into darkness. Talalikhin reached for his ripcord. Yanked it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, snap. The parachute canopy burst open above him. He was alive. He looked down. Somewhere below, somewhere in the dark forests south of Moscow, the shattered Heinkel slammed into the ground and detonated in a fireball that turned the night red. Talalikhin floated alone in the sky. He had done the impossible. The world was silent now. After the violence, the ripping metal, the cannon fire, the tearing of wings, there was nothing but the quiet hiss of cold wind against fabric. Viktor Talalikhin drifted beneath his parachute, watching smoke rise from the flaming wreckage on the forest floor below. His heart was still racing, but part of him felt strangely calm. He had survived the Tehran, but survival wasn't guaranteed yet, not by a long shot. His gloves were soaked. For a moment he thought it was oil from the collision, but it wasn't. It was blood. A shard of glass from his canopy must have sliced his hand during impact. He flexed his fingers. Pain shot through his wrist, but they still moved. Good. Far below, the flaming corpse of the Heinkel continued to burn like a fallen meteor. Talalikhin counted the parachutes. 1, 2, yes. At least 2 Germans had bailed out before the bomber hit. Whether they survived was another question. He didn't care. He tugged gently at his parachute rigging, steering toward a clearing near the edge of a frozen lake. Trees swayed beneath him, too many to risk a landing. He shifted again. Left, southwest, catching a weaker breeze. Then he saw it. Headlights. Moving. Fast. A Soviet search party. Sent to find him. He exhaled. As he drifted lower, he heard shouting from the ground. "Pilot, over here! Hold on, we see you!" The earth raced up to meet him. Talalikhin bent his knees, braced, and hit. The landing knocked the breath from his lungs, but he stayed upright. He collapsed to one knee, clutching his side. Pain shot through his ribs, cracked maybe, broken. He forced himself up, yanked free from his parachute straps, and staggered forward. Red Army infantry emerged from the tree line, rifles raised, then lowered as they recognized his flight uniform. One of them sprinted toward him, a young lieutenant in a wool greatcoat. "Comrade pilot, we thought we lost you," he said, grabbing him by the arm. Talalikhin wiped the blood from his forehead with the back of his glove. "It will take more than a Heinkel to kill me," he muttered. The soldiers stared at him, not with pity, but awe. They had seen the fireball in the sky. They had watched the explosion. None of them believed anyone could survive that. A medic rushed forward. Talalikhin waved him off. "I don't need a doctor, I need a radio." The lieutenant blinked. "A radio?" Talalikhin nodded. "I'm not done. That bomber wasn't alone. There are more out there." He was right. Even now, German raiders, Heinkels, Dorniers, Junkers were swarming toward Moscow under the cover of night. The Luftwaffe thought the Soviet defenses were broken, that the Red Air Force was dying. But not tonight. Talalikhin followed the soldiers toward a waiting gauze truck, limping slightly but refusing help. The lieutenant looked at him as if he were something more than a man, something forged from Russian iron and frost. Then he said the words that would echo across Russia by sunrise. "Comrade, you rammed a bomber. In midair. Why?" Talalikhin paused at the truck door. His answer was simple. "Because I ran out of bullets." 2 hours later, the Soviet propaganda machine exploded. By dawn, Radio Moscow declared Viktor Talalikhin the first Soviet pilot to perform a nighttime aerial ramming attack and survive. Newspapers called him a fearless guardian of the motherland. Crowds gathered outside Red Army recruitment stations. Talalikhin was hailed a hero across the USSR. Morning came heavy and cold over Moscow. Fighter engines coughed to life on airfields still blackened by bomb craters. Mechanics worked with frost-bitten fingers. Pilots who had slept only 2 hours dragged themselves back into their cockpits. The war didn't stop just because someone became a hero. But Viktor Talalikhin didn't return to the sky that morning. He was taken to Moscow, not to rejoin his squadron, but to meet government officials from the Soviet Information Bureau. His ramming attack had made him the new face of Soviet resistance, the perfect symbol. The Kremlin needed him. The people needed him. The truth, that was optional. A legend is manufactured. Talalikhin sat in a dimly lit office near Red Square, still wearing his scorched flight jacket. His cuts were bandaged, his ribs taped. Across from him sat 2 senior officers from the Soviet Press Bureau, a political commissar and a stenographer. A pile of papers was slid across the table to him. "Hero pilot speaks, victory in the night sky." They handed him a pencil. "Sign it," the commissar said. Talalikhin skimmed the first lines. The article claimed he volunteered for a ramming attack, that he chose to sacrifice himself for the motherland, that he intentionally saved Moscow by colliding with the bomber. That wasn't how it happened. He looked up. "This isn't accurate," he said. One of the press officers adjusted his glasses. "It is now." Talalikhin clenched his jaw. "I ran out of ammunition," he said. "I was going to force the Heinkel down. The collision was an act of heroic courage," the commissar interrupted. "One that every Soviet citizen must hear about." Talalikhin stared at him. "I didn't intend to die." The commissar leaned closer. "And yet you were prepared to, yes?" Talalikhin didn't answer. Silence filled the room. Through the window, he could hear the distant rumble of artillery. The war was still there, waiting. He signed the paper. That afternoon, Soviet radio began broadcasting his heroic interview. By midnight, Pravda, the state newspaper, published his story on the front page. People wept in train stations as they heard it. Mothers told their children to remember the name Talalikhin. He was proof that even a single Soviet pilot could bring down fascist machines. Whispers among pilots. Inside air regiments, scattered across the Western Front, pilots gathered around oil drum fires, whispering about the so-called ramming attack. "Ramming a bomber at night? He's mad." No, he's a hero. A hero? Or a fool who got lucky? Maybe he had no choice. Command barely gives us enough ammo to hunt one bomber. You think he did it because he wanted to? No pilot wants to. In private, Soviet pilots knew the truth nobody would ever admit publicly. Ramming was not strategy, it was desperation. With half their aircraft destroyed in the first weeks of the war, with ammunition depots bombed, with fuel rationed, and with pilots sent into combat after as little as 5 hours of flight training, what choice did they have? They could withdraw and face the wrath of political officers, or they could ram and become a hero or a corpse. The official file, restricted access. Decades later, when Soviet archives briefly opened in the 1990s, a classified military report was found. It confirmed Talalikhin was never instructed to perform taran. He launched with less than 120 rounds of cannon ammunition, far below standard load. An internal note from the 3rd Air Army Command stated, Pilot Talalikhin did not choose taran as an attack doctrine. Ammunition depletion forced close interception, leading to collision. A handwritten note in the file added, the political impact of voluntary taran is significant. Do not alter official version. The truth was brutal. Talalikhin was brave, fearless even, but he didn't ram that bomber as part of some bright, glorious plan. He rammed it because the Red Air Force was collapsing, because his guns were empty, because nobody else could stop that bomber. Call it desperation, call it patriotism, call it duty, but don't call it clean. Talalikhin would become a hero of the Soviet Union, medals pinned to his chest, speeches written in his honor. But glory doesn't last long in war, and fate wasn't done with him yet. The medal ceremony was brief. A small stage, red banners, political officials who smiled too wide, reporters who scribbled quotes that had already been written. Viktor Talalikhin stood at attention as they pinned the hero of the Soviet Union gold star to his chest. It was supposed to feel meaningful. It didn't. They handed him a speech to read. He stared at it, then set it aside. Instead, he spoke only one sentence to the crowd. I did my duty, nothing more. No slogans, no propaganda, no speeches about Stalin or the unbreakable spirit of socialism. Just duty. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The crowd roared. He should have stayed in Moscow after that, touring factories, motivating workers, visiting schools, raising war bonds. That's what the Soviet state wanted from him, a living poster. But Viktor Talalikhin didn't want posters. He wanted his squadron. He wanted the front. He wanted to fight. And that made him dangerous. Back to the sky. Against the advice of high-ranking officials, Talalikhin returned to active duty. He refused ceremonial assignments and insisted on flying combat missions near Podolsk, south of Moscow. The German advance was tightening. The Luftwaffe was relentless. He rejoined the 177th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the same unit he had flown with the night he rammed the Henkel. But things had changed since then. The regiment had lost aircraft. Pilots he once flew with were gone, burned alive or buried under wreckage. His comrades greeted him with slaps on the shoulder and cups of black tea, but even they looked at him differently now. He wasn't just another pilot anymore. He was the Talalikhin. And legends don't survive long at the front.
A fight he didn't need to take. October 27th, 1941. A brutal gray dawn. Freezing fog rolled across the pine forests near the village of Podolsk. Talalikhin zipped his flight jacket up to his throat and pulled his gloves tight. He was still battered from his ramming mission. His ribs hadn't fully healed,
but he hid the pain well. "Another night patrol?" he asked the ground chief. "Routine," the chief replied. "Enemy scouts reported near the rail lines. Could be nothing." Nothing. In war, nothing usually means death. Talalikhin climbed into his Yak-1 fighter, a different aircraft from the Lag-3 he had lost in the ramming mission. Sleeker, faster, more responsive. He ran his pre-flight checks, signaled thumbs up, and the prop spun to life. He lifted off and climbed into the bitter sky with two wingmen. For 20 minutes, they saw nothing but cloud and sky. Then, radio crackle. "Spectre 1, I see movement. North by northwest, altitude 1500. Talalikhin narrowed his eyes. Then he saw them. Two Messerschmitt Bf-109s, German fighters, hunters. But they hadn't seen him yet. He could have pulled back, waited for backup, reported contact, and regrouped. Instead, he said into the radio, "Stay high, I'll take the lead." He nosed over and dove. This would be his final fight. The Yak-1 cut through the mist. Talalikhin opened fire, machine gun tracers slicing toward the lead Messerschmitt. The German broke left into a defensive roll. The second dove to flank Talalikhin. It became a knife fight. Low altitude, high speed, no room for error. Talalikhin pulled into a climbing spiral. His engine screamed, metal strained. He flipped the Yak and got behind one of the Messerschmitts, lined up, fired. Hit. Pieces of the 109 tore free as black smoke poured from its engine. It went down. One left. The second Messerschmitt dove to escape. Talalikhin followed. They tore through a cloud bank and came out over the pine forest, barely 300 meters above the ground. Too low. Too fast. The German pilot pulled a brutal turn, trying to get behind Talalikhin. For a split second, their wings almost touched. They passed each other in a blur and climbed in opposite spirals. Then, it happened. A burst of machine gun fire tore across Talalikhin's canopy. A second German fighter, unseen in the clouds above, had joined the fight. Before Talalikhin could react, rounds pierced his cockpit. One struck him in the head. His Yak-1 rolled onto its side, then plunged into the forest. The impact shattered trees for 30 meters. The wreck burned for hours. He never made it out. Viktor Vasilyevich Talalikhin died at 23 years old, less than 3 months after his legendary ramming attack. The Soviets declared him immortal, but somewhere deep in Soviet archives, someone wrote a final note in his file. Pilot Talalikhin refused political assignment, preferred active combat. Risk factor high. Maybe he died a hero. Maybe he died because he wouldn't be controlled. Maybe he died because he couldn't stop fighting. History would never agree.
The news of his death spread fast, faster than truth, faster than grief. Radio Moscow didn't broadcast it at first. The Soviet government feared the psychological impact. The people needed heroes, living heroes. So they delayed the announcement. His regiment buried what was left of him under a stand of birch trees, away from cameras, away from speeches. For 2 days, his death was a military secret. When it was finally announced, it came wrapped in poetry and propaganda. Talalikhin falls, but the sky still belongs to Soviet wings. They turned him into a legend again. A martyr now. He wasn't allowed to just be a soldier who fought and died. He had to be a story. The birth of a Soviet myth. Within weeks, Talalikhin's name was written into history textbooks. He became the official symbol of Taran, the unique Soviet tactic of air-to-air ramming. But what the public didn't know was this. Taran had existed before Talalikhin. More than 200 Soviet pilots had already rammed enemy aircraft by the end of 1941. The tactic wasn't new, it was just necessary. The Red Air Force had been shattered in the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa. In the first 10 days alone, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 4,000 Soviet aircraft, most of them still on the ground. Soviet pilots were forced into the sky with bad radios, faulty oxygen gear, scarce ammunition, and sometimes no gun sights at all. When you can't outgun your enemy, the only thing left is impact. In a classified morale report from the 3rd Air Army, one chilling line was discovered years later. Ramming was not taught, it emerged out of necessity. Pilots will ram rather than abandon their posts. In other words, Taran wasn't a tactic, it was a last stand. And while Stalin's government praised ramming as the ultimate act of Soviet heroism, many aviators hated it.
Inside the mind of a Taran pilot. Decades later, after the war, a Soviet fighter ace named Boris Kovzin, who survived 4 ramming attacks, was asked why Soviet pilots used Taran. His answer was brutally honest. "We didn't want to die. We wanted to win." Another pilot said, "When you have bullets, you shoot. When you don't, you ram. It's simple." But Taran was not simple. It was terrifying, violent, primitive. It was flying straight into death and hoping physics gave you mercy. The average life expectancy of a Western Front fighter pilot in 1941 was 3 days. Calling Taran heroism made it sound noble, clean, but in truth, it was desperation in its purest form. Talalikhin didn't invent it. He survived it once and died fighting like every other pilot, alone in the sky against impossible odds. A legacy of iron and smoke. After his death, Viktor Talalikhin's name was given to streets, lecture halls, a fighter regiment, schools, and eventually a statue in Moscow. His story was told to every generation of Soviet children, a symbol of fearless sacrifice. But here's the question history keeps circling back to. Was Viktor Talalikhin a propaganda creation or a real hero in a war that destroyed men faster than it could honor them? The truth. He was both. He didn't ram that bomber because he wanted to die. He rammed it because he refused to lose. Because he was a hunter from Siberia who had spent his entire life fighting things bigger than himself. Because when it came down to it, he did what he always did. He chased his enemy, and he didn't stop, not even when the bullets ran out. His story isn't about one ramming attack. It's about what a human being is capable of when everything else is gone: hope, comfort, weapons, help, and only willpower remains.